It's no secret that racing can be pretty expensive, and we knew that pretty well before getting into these cars. Legend cars are supposed to be the inexpensive introduction to the sport of racing, but how much does it actually cost for someone to get into these from nothing? Now, I've taken the time to go over the past year and a half of bank statements and everything that we've used to spend money on these cars from owning nothing to where we are now. So we're gonna go over every single cent that we spent throughout our rookie season and try and give you an idea of how much you could be expecting to pay throughout the year. Obviously, everyone's different. You could spend a lot more, you could spend a lot less, but our season ran for about 7 races. We did miss a couple of them, but I feel like for our rookie season, we ran a decent amount of nights and have a pretty good understanding of how much it could cost. Now, in order to get started racing legend cars, the first thing you're gonna need right away is obviously a car. And in June of 2022, we dropped $6,000 on a car that hasn't touched the track since 2019. Now, luckily for us, this came with a handful of spares to include an extra rear end and all that other stuff, plus the drive shafts down below and some other bits and pieces, but little did we know what lied ahead for us. So we knew that car hadn't been on the track in the past couple years and decided it was pretty good for us because that kind of forced us to go through the entire car and give us the familiarization of the whole car, going through every single nut and bolt, taking everything apart, putting it all back together. But during our teardown process, we quickly found out that the motor that came with the car unfortunately had the seals cut on it. It was a 1250 motor, so you can't just throw new seals on because some INEX tech inspector or engine builder needs to go through that and seal them themselves. So unfortunately, what we ended up deciding to do was source locally another 1250 that someone else already had. Luckily, it was a pretty good price point for us, and it was advertised as pretty low nights, so we ended up heading up to Denver and picking up a motor for about 1,500 bucks. Now, our season this year consisted of 7 nights of racing and 1 night of practice out of the 11 nights of racing that were on the schedule. We obviously missed a couple of weekends, but our plan for next year is to obviously try and make as many as we can. But in order for us to race at CNS, we had to register a car number and the car, which cost us about 75 bucks. We also had to register through INEX, make sure we had an INEX license, which cost us about $186. We had registered for the club up here, which is the Rocky Mountain Legends Racing Association. We also had to purchase a MyLapse transponder to run up at CNS. They do give the option to rent one every night, but we figured if we're gonna be running there pretty often, we'd might as well buy one with a single year subscription. Now, every night that we raced, we bought at least 2 pit passes, one for me and one for my wife. Luckily, our kids were able to get in for free since they're young enough. So that cost us about 70 bucks a night, since the track runs $35 pit passes for non-NASCAR members and $25 pit passes for members. Unfortunately, INEX does not count as a NASCAR membership to them, so we had to go with the non-member route and spent a minimum $70 a night doing that. Plus, it's about $100 in fuel for us to get up there and back with our trailer and truck combination. And we also have to board our dogs every time we go up there. So every night that we board our dogs, it's about 95 bucks a night. So now, taking all of that into account, just for us to get on track legally, we are already over $10,000. Now, if you guys have been watching our channel for the past couple months, you would know that this car behind me is not the car that we've been talking about. We ended up actually selling that car about halfway, 3/4 of the way through the season to pick up this car right here, which is an FZ car. We kind of priced it out to figure out whether or not it would be worth it for us to do the FZ09 swap over the winter and try and do a big boy conversion for that old car. But with the amount of chassis updates that car would have needed and the motor cost, plus the new motor being out and only being able to get the MT motor, it would have cost us about $10,000 to $11,000 just to do all the conversion stuff we needed. Instead, this popped up on Marketplace for about $12,000. Luckily, we were able to sell our old car for $7 grand, which meant we were only technically spending about $5 grand on an FZ swap, big boy conversion, all the double shear tabs that you need. So this is a 2020 chassis car. We spent $12,000, sold the old car for $7,000. So now the net difference is about $5,000. And so once we had purchased this car, that pushed us just over that peak of $15,000. Now, as I stated earlier, our old 1250 car had not been on a track since 2019, so we took the opportunity to go ahead and start tearing the car apart completely, stripping it down to a bare chassis, going over every single piece that it had, and replacing everything we felt like needed to be replaced, which unfortunately for us turned out to be quite a bit. We replaced the fuel lines, fuel pump, fuel filter, all of the fuel fittings. We replaced all of the radius rods, the heims, the ball joints, did the plugs, did the plug wires. We tried to make sure everything that we could control was going to be as fresh as possible, but still tried to keep costs down at the time. But of course, right before our first race and us attempting to try and make the final practice, we about nearly burned the car to the ground by grounding out the hot wires on the car, which pretty much destroyed the wiring harness that was in the car. So we ended up having to panic buy, spend about $200 on a brand new wiring harness. Unfortunately, we just didn't have the time to build it on our own, which I'm confident we could do, but we wanted to make sure that we could make it to the track for our first race day. Now, another thing we had to do with the old car was try and get ourselves a set of tires. Unfortunately, that car came only with Federals on the 1.5 2 sets of wheels we got with the car. So unfortunately, that was also the time when Hoosier was having a really difficult time supplying what they needed to INEX, and INEX was having a really difficult time shipping it to the dealers that needed stock. But luckily enough, our dealer happens to be one of the few that got a shipment of tires early in January, so we were able to get ourselves a full set of tires, and then about a month later we were able to go back and pick up another 2 because, like I said, we only had Federal, so having a full set gave us no spares, but we were lucky enough to get a full set and the 2 spares. Now, before our season even started, we ended up taking off the shocks on all 4 corners, taking the springs out, taking them up to our dealer because he's also coincidentally a shock shop. So we had them dyno all of the shocks. We ended up having to replace one of them completely because the shaft was bent. So we ended up being out the 135 bucks or whatever it was at the time, plus the dyno charge for each of the shocks. And we also had them check our spring rates. We ended up getting another spring just based off their recommendation for our setup. And we also got things like a car cover, seat mount bar. You know, we got a new RRC top end fan for the 1250 since we had these old PVC pipe looking fans that probably didn't move a ton of air, but the RRC ones did. We definitely spent quite a bit of money just getting the car ready. Now, once we hit the track with the old car, we immediately started having an issue where we were misfiring. We went through and replaced the blue plate on the back of the motor. We replaced the red box. We redid our valve lash, changing out some of the valve shims to make sure our measurements were right. And of course, once we pulled that blue plate off, we also found that our rear main seal was leaking, so we ended up having to get that seal off of Hank Scott's website. And I'm sure that there's a handful of other things that we did to that car, but by this point we have already made the decision to sell that car and purchase this one, so we no longer had to deal with replacing parts on that car. Now our focus turned to this one, and luckily for us we were able to keep it pretty minimal in terms of parts that needed replacing. For the Legend Invasion weekend, we did have to replace our lower spindle rod as well as our right rear axle seal, and we did unfortunately have to cut the tabs off of our bumpers and weld on some new ones because we did end up bashing into the 95 that one night. And we also ended up having to pick up a brand new coilover kit for our AFCO shocks because while we were changing out the spring and resetting our ride heights, we ended up snapping the bolt that tightens down that collar, and when we tried to go and extract it, we ended up pulling out the rest of the threads on that shock collar. So unfortunately we did have to spend the money on that. We didn't feel the need that we needed to, but we did end up screwing that up to the point to where it was unusable. So all in all, we spent just over $5,600 on dealer parts alone, and I'm including Jim's website over at VMS Motorsports because although he is not technically a legend car dealer, he does supply a lot of parts, so definitely pretty easy to spend a lot of money at those guys. I mentioned earlier that our old car didn't have any of the double shear tabs or anything like that, so anytime we spun out or got even remotely into a wreck, all of those bolts in the rear and everywhere ended up getting overstressed, so unfortunately, we had to replace those bolts a lot. We didn't necessarily have to, I guess, because none of the bolts snapped on us or bent, but we figured everything we've read everywhere tends to say that the best practice is to just replace the bolts anytime you spin because of the amount of stress that they get. So we spent roughly about $438 on hardware alone, and that includes everything from bolts to nuts to safety wire related things to drills and taps and all that stuff. So that's quite a bit of money to spend on hardware, but when you don't have the updated chassis bits, that's kind of what happens. And we unfortunately were buying them from the local farm and fleet or like Lowe's or Home Depot or anything like that, and not necessarily strictly going through somewhere we can get bulk bolts and nuts. So we'll do that for next year and see how much of a difference that makes in terms of purchasing. But yeah, definitely quite a bit of money to spend on hardware. Fortunately for us, we raced a 4-cylinder class in the past, so we got to use all of our safety equipment from running that car, to include our suit, our shoes, our helmet, and all that stuff. The only thing we needed to buy safety equipment wise was we ended up buying a full containment seat, because our original car came with a seat, but it was not a full containment, so we didn't feel super comfortable running with that. We also went through and bought a brand new Schroth Racing 5-point harness, which we had to replace the lap bars on, because when we were initially mounting our seat, we ended up pinching the webbing of the lap bar in between the seat and the chassis and ended up creating a tear in that. We also bought a 4-pole kill switch for the old car, because the original kill switch that came with it was only a 2-pole, so when you flip that kill switch while it was running, it didn't kill the alternator with it. So we got the 4-pole to wrap in our alternator so that once you kill the power, it kills the power to the entire car. Now, safety equipment is definitely something I recommend you not budget on. Try and splurge if you can afford to. Definitely don't get the cheap stuff if you can avoid it, because that's kind of the difference between whether or not you're gonna get burned in a fire really badly, or just kind of a slight burn, or you know, your head and neck restraint. That'll be the difference between whether or not you break your neck in a crash or you just get some pretty minor whiplash. These cars are pretty dangerous and they're not built perfectly, but you can do everything you need to do to make sure that you're as safe as possible in these cars. So definitely spend as much as you can on safety. There's no reason that should be the thing that you try and skimp out on. Now, everything else we spent money on throughout our rookie year kind of doesn't fall into any of the categories we had talked about previously. One thing we did end up getting was a box fan, because with the 1250 and it being an air-cooled motor, we tried to use it to cool down as much as we can in between sessions. We ended up getting a little stagger stick to try and help us out while we were at the track, to make sure that our stagger isn't completely out of whack, and giving us the option to not have to try and bring a tape measure and go around the center line of the wheel every single time or anything like that. We also spent about $300 to get our carbs rebuilt locally by someone who pretty much does it for everyone out here. We also tried to get all of our hub seals, all of our oil filters, and all that stuff from our local parts stores here as well. So all that stuff kind of added up throughout the year. We ended up going up to Denver to pick up a set of practice tires as well, since, you know, everyone's dealers had the issue of the tire shortage. When we first bought our tires, we didn't really have anything to practice on, so we just wanted to have that just so that we're not burning up our good tires on a race day. We also picked up this nitrogen cylinder right before the Legend Invasion weekend, as well as got all of our wheels and tires balanced at a local tire store here. And of course, while we were in the process of making our wheelbase gauge, which is just right there by our jack and bumpers, we ended up running out of our argon CO2 mix, so we did end up having to get that refilled as well, which cost us about $100. Now, I'm certain that there's things that we've spent money on that I've completely forgot about and don't have numbers for, so take this with a grain of salt. Obviously, we ran 7 races throughout the year, so not as many as some people and still more than others. And a majority of your cost is going to depend on what your car market looks like and how much you can pick up a car for. But all in all, for our rookie season, we ended up spending a total of $23,912.15. Had we decided to stick with the 1250 throughout the entire year, you could technically shave $5 off of the price, but who knows what else we would have had to replace after the Invasion weekend, or, you know, if one of the electronic pieces would have been acting up, causing us to spend more than we wanted to. So I do think that it was the best decision to switch from the 1250 to an FC09 car. Now, of course, we can factor in the purse money from the year to our overall total, which we ended up earning about $750 from all the nights that we raced. So now we're closer to right at $23,000, which may seem like a lot to some of you, may not seem like a lot. Some of you probably spent way more, especially if you're buying a brand new car to start the year, then you hit that within the first, couple months. But for us, that's how much we spent in our rookie season, and I hope that you guys found some use in this video. If you're gonna get into these cars, make sure you do your due diligence and do as much research as you can. Figure out what kind of car is gonna be best for you. You can obviously find a pretty cheap 1250 car, but then you may have to do what we did and go over the whole car and end up spending significantly more than you want to. And in the end, you may be beating yourself up and just saying maybe you should have bought a FZ09 car in the first place. But everyone's got to learn. I hope that you guys can learn from this video. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. It is completely free and it helps us out quite a bit. If you enjoyed it, leave a thumbs up. I don't typically ask for it, but I want to get this video out to as many people who need it as possible. So the best way you guys can do that is all the free stuff that you can do. And if you are looking to get into these cars for the first time, I highly recommend checking out one of our past videos. I'll link it down in the description. It showcases everything that I believe you need to know before you even consider racing these. But everyone's opinions are different. If there's something that you believe I missed where you're probably gonna spend money on, go ahead and leave that down in the comment section to help the other racers watching this video know. But as for right now, I've got nothing else for you in this video. I appreciate you guys watching and I hope to catch you in the next one.